you. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Scott.
Hi, how are you?
I'm all right, thank you. I'm very good.
Good to hear it. So, firstly, without giving too much away, and for those listeners joining in today, can you tell us a bit about your books, but particularly the ones I'm really in kind of question of is The Clockwork Crow, The Velvet Fox, and if you can, share with us a little bit of insight about The Midnight Swan coming in October.
Well, there they are.
Brilliant.
Clockwork Crow.
I got my copy too.
Great covers. I think they're really good covers. Basically, I had an idea. Well, it wasn't an idea. It was just the words popped into my head, The Clockwork Crow. And I just thought, what a great title that is for a book. And then I just started to elaborate on it like you do and think, well, how is it possible to have a clockwork crow and who is he? And then I started to sort of elaborate the story in my head, really. So basically, it's a Victorian story. It's set at Christmas, and it's about a little girl called Seren Rees, and is an orphan, and she's on her way to what she hopes is going to be a great new life in a big old country house in Wales. She's never had a family, so she really wants this family to work out, and she's really looking forward to this marvelous Christmas that she imagines. And on the way, she's on a railway station very late at night. It's very cold and frosty, and she's on her own. And she meets a man who gives her a newspaper parcel and asks her to look after it for a while, for 5 minutes. And then because he's very worried about them, he calls them, something that's outside. And he goes outside and he doesn't come back. So Seren is stuck with the parcel. And I don't want to give too much away, but obviously when she opens it, inside are the pieces of a clockwork bird, and she puts him together and winds him up, and he speaks.
And where did the idea for the speaking part of The Clockwork Crow come from?
I knew he was going to talk as soon as I thought of him. I knew he was going to be somebody under a spell who wants to get out, but as soon as he started to speak, he had his own character and personality.
Oh, so definitely.
He's very sort of vain, very proud, very tetchy, very temperamental. And he had that voice as soon as he began to speak.
Is it based on anyone you know, per se?
No, not at all. Not at all.
And then you said that The Clockwork Crow then it evolved into a trilogy as well. And you showed The Midnight Fox there as well. And I know you might do a little bit of a reading from it too.
Yeah, the velvet.
A beautiful cover again.
Yeah.
How much kind of collaboration did you have with Anne Glenn with the covers?
Quite a bit. Well, with the first one mostly. We went through several sort of colour variations of it. So first it was quite white with the gold on it, but I preferred the dark. We had dark variations, so I preferred the dark. And we just twiddled with it until we got the colours right. I think they're really beautiful colours. And then with the Velvet Fox, because it's set in autumn, with the leaves coming down, I very much wanted a sort of coppery bronze sort of feel to the autumn leaves. And I think she did it really well.
Absolutely. Would you like to share a little bit from the Velvet Fox?
Velvet Fox. Okay. Little bit of introduction. A governess comes to the house, very strange woman, and she gives Thomas, the little boy of the house, a present. And the present is a toy carousel with little figures on it. But Seren is very suspicious of this woman from the start, quite rightly. And this little bit, she wakes up at night and she creeps downstairs to see that something really strange has happened to the carousel. Seren looked back. The corridor was shadowy. A suit of armour at the far end seemed to stare at her. "Who's there?" she whispered. Curtains moved in silent drafts. Out of the shadows came a soft, velvety laugh. It scared her. There was something dark and mocking in it. So she turned and ran until she got to the landing and then looked back. But the corridor was empty. The tinkly music was louder now, and there was an odd, circular whirring sound. Lights moved softly over the walls. Gaudy fairground colours, red, green, blue. Glints of gold sparkled off the mirrors. Seren reached the banisters at the top of the stairs and she peered through. Then she gasped. The carousel was standing in the very centre of the hall. It had grown bigger and it was turning with a creaky motion. Music and light flickered, the golden ball shimmered, the striped pole spun, the empty horses galloped. Thomas sat beside it in his tartan dressing gown, staring at it with wide dark eyes, as if it had completely hypnotized him now. Behind him sat Mrs. Honeybourne in a large chair, cramming sweets into her mouth from a glass bowl on her lap. But what astonished Seren most were the others. They were as tall as people, and they were quite clearly alive. The soldier was leaning in the drawing room doorway, beating a brisk rhythm on the drum. The juggler, in his green striped tailcoat and silver wig, sprawled lazily across 2 chairs, his feet crossed at the ankles, flinging 6 balls into the air. The dancer was beautiful. Delicately she spun and leapt around the carousel, her white dress rippling like snow. They were all tall and thin. Their eyes were slivers of silver, and their hair as pale as thistledown. They were the Tulwith Teg. At that moment, Mrs. Honeybourne raised her head, then suddenly her gloved hand. The music stopped in mid-note. "A human," Mrs. Honeybourne said softly, "is spying on us." Seren held her breath. Mrs. Honeybourne looked up at the landing, straight at her. "Up there," she said.
Thank you very much. No, I'm transfixed. You read so atmospherically and so absorbingly too. And I just wondered that because we're talking about the Clockwork Crow and the Velvet Fox, and I know within it there's kind of verses and at the start of the chapters interspersed throughout. Do you find that writing, because I don't know if many of our listeners today know that you're a poet as well as an author. Do you find that poetry helps you with your writing, and especially when you're thinking about how words go together and the semantics too?
Yes, they do. I mean, they're very similar, poetry and prose. Poetry is more attuned, more intent. So yeah, I do like to sort of put little tiny poetry fragments at the beginning of each chapter, just to tease the reader, to make them think, "Oh, what's going to be in this chapter?" And it also helps me add to the mystery of the book as well.
When you kind of write with your kind of prose rather than your poetry, does it take more thought, more time, or which do you find kind of what's striking the balance between writing poetry and writing prose?
It's hard to write poetry when you're writing a novel, because the sort of rhythm is different. The rhythm in your head of the words is different. So when I'm writing a novel or a book like this, I tend not to write much poetry at the same time. So what I'm doing with the novel is I'm being pulled through by the narrative. So the narrative keeps me going like day from day to find out what's going to happen next, because usually I don't know either. So that's what keeps it going. Whereas with a poem, it's different. You write the poem. It takes more time, even though it's much smaller, because you're concentrating on every single word and every sound as well. So they're quite different, really.
Yeah. Do you when you say that you don't know where you're kind of going next, so you're not a planner when we talk about authors that plan at all?
I'm afraid not. I'm not a good planner. I start out with a vague idea what the end is going to be, but then the middle is a total mystery. And I think that's good, because I can't give any surprises or secrets away because I don't know them. So I find, just like the reader does, I find out when I get there what's happening. Often I have to go back and rewrite bits, but I think it's a more adventurous and interesting way to write, really.
No, definitely. Sounds like it's all part of the fun, really, and both for reader and writer.
Right, yeah.
In terms of you as an author, I think I came to one of your events before, and you spoke a lot about the influences of becoming an author. I think a lot you spoke about your dad and the influence that he had on you and him reading aloud to you. Is he the
Oh
main
yeah,
influence for you as becoming an author, or are there lots of influences?
there are lots, but he was obviously the earliest one. Um, my dad didn't have a lot of education, but he was a natural reader. He loved to read. He always had a book on the go, and he introduced me to the library very early. So we would go to the library every week and borrow books. So it just seemed a natural thing always to have a book. And then sometimes, if I really nagged him, because he didn't like doing it, he would read to me like a bedtime story. Um, but I had to really nag for that. But yeah, the idea of being a reader was something that he sort of introduced me to. And then after that, from going to the library and reading all these fantastic authors, that's where you get your ideas and your desire to be a writer, to be like them, to have your books on those shelves, just like they did.
And how does it feel when you see your book on the shelf now in a library or a bookstore, or as an award winner, really?
It's great. I mean, obviously I've got used to it now, but when I started off, it was you just sort of went and stared at it on the shelf for a very long time. So yeah, it was really, really good. But it's always great to see a book out there, and it's also really good to see people reading your book. Once or twice, I've seen people reading my books and they didn't know I was there. So that was really great.
And what about when you go into schools and when you work with children who are reading your book? Because I know I hosted a book club in school and they were fascinated with the Clockwork Crow. They absolutely wanted more and they were so pleased to hear about the Velvet Fox. And then when you came in, they were really, really keen to see you.
Yeah, it's always good for kids to see the author, to meet the author of the book. It sort of brings the book more to life in a way, I think. And you can talk about the stuff behind the book, how it was written and so on. And for me, it's really good because I get to meet the readers. I get to see how they respond, which bits they like, what bits in the book attract them most, what characters they like, bits they enjoy. So I get feedback from that, which is valuable for me as a writer, to do when I come to the next book, to be able to sort of tailor it a bit so I know what people enjoyed in the last one. So yeah, it's very helpful. And it's really great to get out and meet teachers as well
Yeah.
and to move the book to them.
Do you ever find that you maybe steal a name that you like of a child, or steal something like a teacher's name, maybe?
I steal all the time. I steal everything all the time. I used to be a teacher at one time, and I used to steal names from the registers constantly.
Do you find that your experience as a teacher then has helped you too?
Yes, very much actually. I taught year 4, 5, and 6 at different times. And this was a long time ago when you had a bit more time, I think, in the day. I
Yeah.
used to read to them the last thing at night. I used to, last thing in the afternoon, I would read them a novel. We read a whole novel. Things like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Stig of the Dump, those sorts of books. And reading aloud to children really taught me what holds their attention and what makes them bored. And I could tell which bits were working in the novels that I was reading. Even really well-known books like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There are bits in that book which children just cannot stop listening to. They are so interested in. And there are other bits where they get a little bit bored, and I could see that. So yeah, it was a great lesson for me.
Do you talking when about your teaching experience? Then you've taught your year 4, 5, and 6. That's what I've taught. So it's nice to have that in common. And another thing we've got in common is that they would both live in Newport. So how do you think that really the community of Newport or the heritage and culture of Wales has played an important part in your writing too?
Well, Wales, a huge amount really. All the sort of Welsh myths, legends, folk tales, landscape, all the places around Newport. I've set books in many places around Newport because they're the places that interest me and that I know best. So yeah, that's been really important. Maybe the town a bit less so, but certainly the area, hugely important. And I think for anybody, the places that you know best are the places you can work out of. Even if you sort of transport them to another planet and something like that, those places are real places, and that's what makes the book real, however fantastic the other elements in the book are.
Do you think then that with being Welsh, do you think that the community of Welsh writers has helped you at all, or do you think you have friends with authors that help you in that respect too?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there is a strong community of writers in Wales and poets as well. who I know, very well. But there are also writers outside Wales too. So yeah, there are lots of different influences, I think.
If I could ask you to name 3 writers or poets from Wales to read or to listen to, who would you say?
What, for children to read,
Yeah,
listen to? Oh gosh.
not to put you on the spot.
That is. Yeah, I mean, poets, I could name easily people like Edward Thomas, David Jones. These are the poets that I really love from Wales. They're not poets who write specifically for children, they're just really good poets. In terms of writers, Eloise Williams is a great writer and she's doing really well at the moment. So, there are lots of writers who are sort of coming up. I suppose the writers I read when I was a kid were not from Wales because there weren't that many Welsh writers around at that time. So the writers that influenced me, people like Robert Louis Stevenson, Alan Garner, Kevin Crossley Holland, those sort of writers are not Welsh writers, but there you go.
Uh-huh. I want to ask you now too about working with a Welsh publisher too, with Firefly, and ask you kind of how does it feel to work closely with them and see your idea go from, well, initial idea to page and then to, like we said, bookshelf or library.
Yeah, it's really good. I mean, I usually work with big London publishers, and it's very, very different, working with a small local publisher, people I know well. It's much more, close up. You get much more feedback. They know who you are, which is not always true in the sort of London world. But yeah, we had, I wrote the book. We had a lot of back and forth, a lot of editing on the book. I had a big input in the cover design, which again is not that usual these days. So I really felt involved with the process of making the book and creating the actual physical book and then promoting it. Sarah and Firefly are very good at promotion and getting the book out there and getting people interested in it, and bloggers and people like yourself in schools and stuff. So that was really interesting as well, because that doesn't happen as well with the bigger publishers, I think.
Do you notice working with them as editors and things that the process has changed, maybe from the Clockwork Crow to the Velvet Fox to the Midnight Swan? Do you think it's been more refined, or?
It depends on the book, really, how the book went. So there was some editing on the first book, The Clockwork Crow, just to get it right. The Velvet Fox didn't really have much editing because it just came out right. Sometimes that happens. And well, the Midnight Swan, we just finished the editing on that. So there was a little bit more on that. We had to make sure everything in the third book ties up and finishes off nicely and everything is covered.
Fab. With talking about Wales as well, and your book being a Tŷ na Nog winner, do you feel like your life's changed since winning that award?
It hasn't changed, but it was really great to win it. I mean, I'd won it before. I won it a while back with a book called Candleman. So it was the second time I'd actually won it. But it was really great for the book to get all that publicity, for everyone to see it, for it to get around all the schools and libraries. And also the Blue Peter thing was really big as well, that it was on Blue Peter and national television and so on. So that affected the sales hugely. So it was great. I mean, any publicity for books, there are so many good books out there that any publicity is helpful, really. So I enjoyed the thing, especially, yeah.
In terms of, you say now you're kind of closing the book per se on the Clockwork Crow trilogy, what kind of, do you have anything in motion to go on to next?
Yeah, I always do. I have a couple of ideas for young adult books, which I'm working on. Can't say too much about them really, because they're top secret, but they'd be for an older age group than these. But yeah, I'm quite interested in sort of doing something along that lines, just for change. I like to sort of change around what I'm doing, a bit, so that you don't get stuck in the same age group or the same sort of way of thinking. So that now that I've done these 3, I really want to do something completely different for myself.
Do you have a particular favourite age group to write for, or have you ever written for adults?
No, I've never written for adults, except for the poetry, which is, of course, for adults.
Yeah.
I don't actually choose an age group. I just write the story. and the story, as you know, dictates who reads it, really. So suddenly you're writing a story which is very complex, like for instance, my set, the Chronoptica Quartet, the Obsidian Mirror, and the other books in that set are really quite complicated. There's lots of characters, there's lots of time travel, and so that means that, you know, they're going to be read by year 8, 9, that sort of age group, 10, not the sort of lower, younger children. So very much depends on the story that, you know, sort of makes the reader, really.
Would you ever dip into maybe a picture book or go something completely different?
I don't think so.
No.
I think it's really, no, that's not my thing, really. It's a real skill to do a picture book. I don't think I've got that skill.
In terms of talking about your other books, which would you say, if you had to recommend, as I say, I like this number of 3, if you could recommend 3 of your books to read for our listeners today, which ones would they be if they want to go on to something else from the Clockwork Crow trilogy?
Okay, well, for a sort of the same age group, I would recommend, there's one called The Candleman, which is quite a book I wrote a while ago about a man who's under a spell that his life will end when a certain candle burns out, which is fine, but then he loses the candle and it falls into the hands of his greatest enemy. So that's that first one. Then I wrote a book called, in fact, one of my earliest books was a book called The Conjurer's Game, which is about a board game, a very strange old Welsh board game, which a boy starts off by accident and has to sort of stop before it goes too mad. And maybe the third one, maybe a bit more recent, I would say The Obsidian Mirror, which is the time travel story, where a boy and a girl from the future get together to find out about the strange machine called the Obsidian Mirror, which is supposed to be able to travel in time. So maybe those 3.
Sounds fantastic. I'll definitely pass those recommendations on to my class too. In terms of kind of bringing the interview to a close a little bit, what kind of advice would you have for young budding authors, young budding writers, poets? If they could take away one thing from this interview that you could give them, what would it be?
Well, if it had to be one thing, it would have to be that they have to read, because
Absolutely.
you can't write. Yeah, you can't write. You don't know what writing is unless you really fill your head with the best literature, poetry, stories that you can, and non-fiction too, so that you've got inside you've got this treasure trove of stuff that you can use, because you can't write out of nothing. So you need to know what good writing is and what it sounds like and what it feels like to read it. So I would say, if you do nothing else for the next 5 years, just read. You know, and don't worry about writing stuff. I didn't start writing stuff until I was in my 20s, you know, seriously. So I mean, obviously I wrote things before that in school, but I never really had the idea that this is what I was going to do until then. But I did read. I just crammed my head full of books, and then when I started to write, I knew what literature was. I knew what poetry was. I knew what good stories were, and I think that's what you need most of all.
I can say it or think it any better myself. That is the best advice. I'm just thinking now, in terms of, you say about packing your head full of literature, and that's how you came to know literature. Would you say that it's not about the techniques of writing per se for young children? It's more about understanding how words fit together and listening to them, like you said, with packing your head full of literature?
Yeah, it's understanding how the story works, you know, and not on a conscious level even, but sort of deep down, they know that this is how a story works, you know, and that it starts off with perhaps a mystery or a problem and a character, and then it gradually builds up to a sort of climax at the end. And they learn about things like escapes and traps and people betrayed, and the author tricking you so that you think one thing and actually it's another thing happening. And they sort of learn that the tricks, the way that an author does this, just by reading it, really, and by understanding it in that way. So I don't think it's too much about the techniques. No, I think you learn that in school. You learn, you know, grammar and punctuation and all that stuff, and you need all that. But that's not about writing. Writing is about plot and character, really.
Absolutely. I transfix, like I said, listening to it. It's so great to hear an author say that listening to stories, absorbing them, digesting them, just being entranced by them really is all part of, well, the main part of understanding how stories work, how stories are composed, and really just taking that on and absorbing themselves in it. I just love it. I really, really do.
Good.
No, I really, really want to say a really, really big thank you for joining us today. It's been fantastic listening to you, and I really, really wish you all the success with the Midnight Swan and with all your books, because every child should be at least reading one of them.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. And The Midnight Swan is out in October, and it'll be the third and last book about the Clockwork Crow. So look out for it.
Oh, we can't wait. We're definitely eagerly anticipating it. No, thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you to all our listeners today for listening in, and thank you for coming to the virtual Pontypridd Children's Literature Festival 2020. Diolch yn fawr. Bye.
Everybody.